The drawer does not have a label. Drawer 17. Third cabinet from the left. A storage archive in Lower Manhattan that nobody visits anymore. The kind of place that smells like forgotten decisions. Inside it sits a photograph. Black and white. Edges soft with age. 4 figures standing before the New York skyline in the winter of 1912. 2 men in the center, both silver-haired, both wearing the kind of dark wool coats that whisper old money without screaming it. Their jaws are set like they have never once second-guessed a decision in their lives. To the left stands a young woman, sharp-eyed, chin lifted just slightly, like she already knows something the camera does not. To the right, another young woman, lighter complexion, warm smile, the kind of ease that only comes from never having been told no. Behind all 4 of them, the skyline rises, half-finished. Cranes are still visible, a city writing its own future in steel. That photograph once hung inside the most powerful private boardroom in Manhattan. Mahogany frame, center wall. Right where every man who walked into that room would see it and understand exactly who they were dealing with. Now it sits in drawer 17, and nobody knows why. These 4 people, the Caldwell patriarchs and their daughters, controlled something most Americans never knew existed. Not buildings, not companies. The financial scaffolding behind all of it. Railroad bonds, steel contracts, harbor expansion, insurance on skyscrapers that would later become the face of New York City. If you trace the paperwork behind nearly half the construction projects built between 1890 and 1925, the money pointed back to one quiet family office on East 63rd Street, the Caldwell Consortium. Hi viewers, please comment one word. If you built something this powerful, would you protect or expand it? Just one word. Protect or expand. And if you don't subscribe now, you may never see this channel again. So why wait? Hit that subscribe button right now and, done that? Now let's dive in. They did not own the skyline. They owned the debt that built it. The photograph was taken at the absolute peak of their power, taken on a Tuesday, framed by Friday, hung on the wall the following Monday. 3 weeks later, the first quiet mistake was made, and nobody in that photograph saw it coming, because the most dangerous mistakes never arrive with a warning. They arrive dressed as opportunity. Cornelius Caldwell did not inherit wealth. He built the machine that produced it. Born in 1851 in Baltimore to a family of modest shipping clerks, Cornelius grew up watching money move without ever touching it. His father tracked cargo. His uncles wrote contracts. Nobody in his family owned anything significant. They managed what other men owned. That observation lived inside Cornelius for 20 years before it became a strategy. He entered the shipping trade in his early 20s as a contract broker, the kind of position that paid just enough to stay hungry. But while other brokers chased commissions, Cornelius studied the invisible connective tissue of commerce. He mapped how money flowed between industries. He noticed something that would change everything he ever did. Cities did not grow because of vision. Cities grew because someone agreed to carry the risk that vision required. Railroads needed steel. Steel mills needed insurance against fire and accident. Insurance companies needed capital reserves. Capital reserves needed somewhere to grow. Ports needed warehouse financing. Warehouses needed rail connections. It was a circular system that fed itself endlessly, and if a man positioned himself at the critical junctions where risk changed hands, he did not need to build a single thing. He just needed to be the one everyone came to when they were afraid. Cornelius became that man. He financed a bridge in 1882 when 3 engineering firms had already walked away from the project. He funded a rail tunnel beneath the Hudson when the previous attempt had collapsed and killed 9 workers. When the banking panic of 1907 sent Wall Street into a controlled collapse, Cornelius walked into the chaos and bought failing municipal bonds by the trainload. Everyone thought he was reckless. He was patient. There is a difference between those two things, and most people spend their entire lives unable to tell them apart. By 1910, the Caldwell office held financing positions behind some of the most significant infrastructure in New York's history. Not as the builder, not as the public face, as the quiet hand that made it all possible. He kept no public profile, gave no interviews, lived in a home that was large but not ostentatious. He believed, with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been proven wrong, that visibility weakened power. The family that nobody watched could see everything. He built the dynasty on one principle above all others: patience. And then he made the single greatest mistake of his life. He assumed his sons had learned it too. Cornelius Caldwell raised two sons who could not have been more different if he had designed them that way on purpose. Thaddeus Caldwell was the elder, 34 years old in 1912. Quiet the way deep water is quiet. Still on the surface, everything moving underneath. He read contracts the way other men read scripture. He kept records of every financial decision the family office had made, going back 15 years, organized in green ledger books that he updated by hand every Friday evening without exception. To Thaddeus, wealth was architecture. You built it carefully, you maintained it religiously, and you never touched the foundation no matter how attractive the upper floors looked. Then there was Devereux. Devereux Caldwell was 29. He had his mother's laugh. Loud, genuine, the kind that made rooms turn. He had his father's intelligence, but wore it differently, pointed outward at people and possibilities rather than inward at numbers and caution. He could walk into a room full of strangers and walk out with 3 new business relationships and an invitation to dinner. Where Thaddeus saw wealth as something to protect, Devereux saw it as something to multiply. For years, Cornelius held the balance between them without effort. His presence alone was enough. When the brothers argued in board meetings, and they argued often, a single look from the old man ended it. His authority was the gravitational center that kept everything in orbit. Then, one January morning in 1914, Cornelius Caldwell did not come down for breakfast. His youngest daughter, Adese, knocked on his bedroom door at 8:30. No answer. She opened the door slowly. He was gone. Quietly. In his sleep. The way powerful men sometimes leave. Without ceremony, without warning, without the dramatic exit the world expects. By noon, Thaddeus sat at the head of the board table with the posture of a man who had been preparing for this exact moment for a decade. Devereux sat across from him with the barely contained energy of a man who had been waiting for it. The advisors who had served Cornelius for 30 years looked at both sons without expression. Outside on Fifth Avenue, New York was changing faster than anyone had a name for, and Devereux Caldwell was already watching it through the window. New York in 1922 did not slow down for grief. It moved, loudly, visibly, with the kind of momentum that made caution look like a character flaw. Towers climbed where tenements had stood. Banks that had been conservative for 50 years discovered they had an appetite for bold lending after all. Investment groups formed overnight, promising returns that would have sounded delusional before the war. The city was reinventing itself every single season, and the people making money in it were not the ones asking careful questions. They were the ones saying yes before the sentence was finished. Devereux Caldwell walked through that city and felt something shift inside him that he could not name and did not try to. He began bringing proposals to the board. Carefully framed at first, small redirections of existing capital into Manhattan real estate positions, hotels near the new transit lines, luxury apartment towers being developed on the Upper West Side, investment partnerships tied to the city's visible, unstoppable expansion. Thaddeus read every proposal twice before responding. His objections were detailed and specific. Their father had built the family's power by financing infrastructure that cities cannot abandon, regardless of economic conditions. Rail lines ran whether the economy was strong or weak. Ports moved cargo regardless of market sentiment. That was the entire point. The Caldwell holdings were designed to survive panic because they were tied to necessity. Luxury property was different. Luxury property needed tenants who felt confident enough to pay premium rents. It needed buyers who believed tomorrow was worth investing in today. It needed the continued cooperation of public optimism. And optimism, Thaddeus said quietly during one board meeting, was the only currency with no guaranteed backing. Devereaux listened to every word. Then he put the first quarter returns on the table. The early real estate positions had performed beyond any projection. The numbers were clean, documented, impossible to argue with. The momentum was real. Advisors who had sided with Thaddeus began reviewing their positions. More proposals followed, each one slightly larger, each one slightly more leveraged than the one before. Nobody said the word leverage out loud, but it was there in every document, sitting quietly between the projected returns and the risk disclosures, waiting. Hidden deep inside the balance sheets, beneath the rising numbers, beneath the celebration, one quiet structural shift had already begun. The foundation had started to change, and only one man in the entire building understood what that meant. Spring, 1927. The boardroom on East 63rd Street. 10 men around the table and a proposal that would define everything that came after. Devereaux Caldwell stands at the front of the room and does not sit down. He never sits when the stakes matter. He places a bound document on the table. 40 pages, detailed projections, architectural renderings, investor commitments already secured. A luxury tower. The most ambitious project in Caldwell family history. For the first time, the family name would appear on the building's facade, not hidden behind shell companies and quiet partnerships. The Caldwell name, in stone, visible from 3 blocks away. Thaddeus reads the document without expression. He turns pages slowly. The room watches him. When he finally speaks, his voice is steady. He reminds the board of something their father said once during the banking panic of 1907, that the Caldwell office had survived every financial collapse since 1882 for one reason only. They had never tied their survival to what other people chose to believe. Infrastructure did not require belief. It required use. And people used rail lines and ports and insurance systems regardless of whether the market was celebrating or burning. This tower, Thaddeus says, requires belief. It requires tenants who feel confident. It requires buyers who trust the future. The moment that confidence breaks, the asset becomes a liability. He looks directly at his brother. Devereaux looks back at him with the particular expression of a man who has already won and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. 3 institutional investors are already committed. The projected returns exceed anything the family's existing portfolio has generated in a decade. The construction timeline is solid. The location is irreplaceable. The vote passes 7-3. Construction begins within the month. And for 2 full years, everything Devereaux promised comes true. The tower rises. Tenants sign long-term leases. The Caldwell name appears in stone above a building that becomes one of the most discussed addresses in Manhattan. Newspapers write about it. Society pages photograph it. Investors who miss the first opportunity begin calling the office asking how to get into the next one. Thaddeus attends none of the celebrations. He sits in his office in the evenings, reading bond reports, watching numbers that nobody else is watching, tracking a slow and quiet shift in the underlying structure of everything the family has built. He does not say a word to anyone, because the numbers will say it for him. And within 24 months, the entire financial environment holding this tower up will disappear. Not gradually, not with warning, but overnight. The way confidence always does when it finally decides to leave. The pencil marks appeared in October 1928. Small, precise. Made in the margins of the family's private ledger books by a 26-year-old account manager named Zuri Caldwell, no relation to the family. Just a young woman from Harlem who had earned her position by being the sharpest reader of numbers in any room she entered. Zuri did not make dramatic announcements. She made pencil marks. 1 mark meant watch this. 2 marks meant this is moving wrong. 3 marks meant someone needs to see this immediately. By the end of October 1928, 17 entries across 4 ledger books carried 3 marks each. She brought them to Thaddeus on a Thursday afternoon after the other board members had left. She placed the books on his desk without a word and opened to the first flagged page. Thaddeus looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he looked at Zuri. She said only this: "The ratio has flipped." He knew exactly what she meant. When Cornelius Caldwell ran the family office, more than 70% of the family's financial activity was tied to infrastructure: rail, ports, insurance, municipal bonds, stable, boring, unshakable. The remaining 30% sat in growth positions, carefully managed. That ratio had now fully reversed. More than 60% of the Caldwell financial activity depended on Manhattan property values holding steady, luxury tenants renewing leases, and investors continuing to pour money into a market that had been rising without interruption for 6 consecutive years. Thaddeus wrote a 7-page memo that weekend. Formal, specific. He outlined exactly where the exposure sat, what conditions would need to change for it to become dangerous, and what the board needed to do immediately to rebalance. He distributed it Monday morning with a handwritten note asking every board member to read it before Thursday's meeting. 3 people responded. At the Thursday meeting, Devereaux acknowledged the memo with a nod. Then he introduced a 22-page counter-analysis prepared by an outside consulting firm that demonstrated, with charts and projections and the kind of professional confidence that expensive consultants specialize in, that the family's risk exposure remained within acceptable limits. The board accepted the counter-analysis. Zuri sat in the back of that room and said nothing. She was not on the board. She had no vote. She closed her notebook, stood up quietly, and walked back to her desk. She did not erase the pencil marks. Outside the windows of the Caldwell office, the city celebrated itself the way it always did, loudly, way visibly, without any awareness of what was quietly shifting beneath it. 1 year later, everything in those ledger books would be proven right, and by then it would be too late to do anything except watch. The market cracked on a Thursday morning in October 1929, and the Caldwell board did not panic. That was the first mistake. Devereaux stood at the head of the table within 48 hours and delivered a steady, confident assessment. The crash was a correction. The fundamentals had not changed. The family's asset base was real, documented, and substantial. They would hold their positions, manage their obligations, and come out the other side stronger than their competitors who were selling in fear. The room believed him because he believed himself. What Devereaux did not account for, what no amount of consulting reports had modeled, was the speed at which trust disappears once it decides to leave. Banks that had extended generous repayment windows for years sent notices within 30 days, demanding immediate settlement. Investors who had committed capital to the hotel project exercised contract exit clauses that had been written into the agreements as formalities. Clauses nobody had seriously expected anyone to use. Luxury tenants in the Caldwell Tower began calling about lease modifications, then about exits. A men's clothing firm on the 4th floor vacated without warning on a Tuesday in December. A law practice on the 7th floor gave notice the same week. By January 1933, full floors sat empty in a building that had been fully occupied 8 months earlier. Adiz Caldwell, Cornelius's youngest daughter, now managing the family's property accounts, walked those empty floors on a Friday afternoon in February. Her footsteps echoed. She stood at a window on the 6th floor and looked out at the street below. People still moved through the city. Taxis still ran. The skyline still stood. But the money that had made all of it feel permanent was moving in a different direction now. She called Thaddeus that evening. He already knew. The family began selling assets to cover debt obligations that speculative expansion had quietly accumulated over 3 years. Rail investments went first, then shipping contracts, then 2 of the insurance holdings that Cornelius had spent a decade carefully building. Each sale was necessary. Each sale removed another support from the structure. Thaddeus sat in his office late into the evenings and tracked every transaction in the green ledger books. The numbers told a story that nobody on the board wanted to read out loud. Devereaux stopped attending evening sessions. He began arriving late to morning meetings. Then one Monday, he did not come in at all. His assistant said he was traveling on business. Nobody asked where. The worst of the damage had not yet arrived. It was still working through the structure quietly, the way water works through a wall, invisible until the moment the surface gives way completely. There was no front page, no trial, no single day anyone could point to and say, that was when it ended. It ended the way powerful things always end, when nobody is watching closely enough, in paperwork. By 1931, the Caldwell private banking operation was drawing attention from financial regulators who had begun examining exposure levels across New York's old money institutions. What they found inside the Caldwell books was not fraud. It was not criminal. It was something in certain ways more damaging than either of those things. It was a family that had survived every financial crisis since 1882 by staying close to its foundation, and then, in the space of a single decade, had quietly walked away from everything that foundation was built on. The regulators filed their findings in language that was measured and professional. The underlying meaning was clear to anyone who could read a balance sheet. The Caldwell Consortium was no longer structured to survive a sustained downturn. By 1933, the remaining Manhattan real estate holdings were sold, not in triumph, not in negotiation. In necessity, asset after asset moved to settle debt obligations that had compounded past the point of management. The flagship tower, the building with the Caldwell name carved in stone above the entrance, sold at a number that did not cover what the construction had cost 6 years earlier. The private family bank closed in 1937. The official statement used the word restructuring. The internal records used different words. Thaddeus withdrew from public life. He moved to a smaller property in Connecticut. He took the green ledger books with him. He never gave a public statement about what had happened. He simply left. Devereaux was last documented in a passenger manifest leaving New York in the spring of 1934. Destination listed as France. He did not return. Adesa remained in New York the longest. She spent 3 years managing the final disposition of the family's remaining assets. Methodical, quiet, doing the work that nobody else wanted to do. In 1940, she moved to Philadelphia. She took nothing from the office except one item, the photograph from drawer 17. She kept it in her home until she died. The Caldwell name disappeared from Manhattan financial directories by 1938. One entry, then none. The family that had quietly financed half the infrastructure of the greatest city in the world dissolved into legal filings and auction records that nobody read. No fire, no scandal, no dramatic ending. Just absence, spreading slowly until it filled the entire space where a dynasty had stood. But one thing remained in Manhattan that the Caldwell family had touched, and it was still standing. The iron gate did not move when the mansion came down. The Caldwell estate on East 63rd Street was demolished in 1956. The building that replaced it was modern, clean, and completely anonymous, the kind of structure that carries no memory of what stood before it. New tenants moved in. New lives filled the floors. Nobody asked questions about the ground they were standing on. But the developers kept the gate. Nobody recorded why. There is no meeting minute that explains the decision. Perhaps one architect on the project understood that some things should outlive their context. Perhaps it was simply overlooked in the demolition plans. The engraving across the top reads, Caldwell House. Residents walk past it every single morning. Most assume it is decorative, a design choice meant to give the building a manufactured sense of history. They have no idea what name that iron once announced. They have no idea what passed through that gate at the height of its power. 3 blocks away, a building that Cornelius Caldwell financed in 1898 still stands on West 34th Street. A brass plaque near the entrance carries his name. Office workers pass it every day without slowing. They do not know that the man on that plaque once quietly sat behind the financing of rail lines they have ridden, ports that moved goods they have used, bridges they have crossed without a second thought. They do not know that the fortune which made all of that possible collapsed because one generation confused patience with weakness and expansion with wisdom. The gate stands. The plaque remains. The city moves past both of them every single day. An empire becomes a plaque. A dynasty becomes a gate. and the name survives in iron long after every person who understood what it meant has gone. That is not a sad ending. That is a warning. Every dynasty believes its success proves something permanent. The Caldwell Consortium built one of the most powerful financial networks in New York history. They did it without headlines, without spectacle, and without a single unnecessary risk. Cornelius Caldwell spent 40 years proving that the quietest position in any system is often the most powerful one. The position where risk changes hands, where necessity meets financing, and where the work that nobody sees makes everything else possible. Then, one generation looked at what patience had built and decided that speed would build it better. Thaddeus saw it happening and could not stop it. Zuri Caldwell marked the ledgers and nobody listened. Adizi walked the empty floors and understood what the numbers had been trying to say for 2 years. But understanding something and having the authority to change it are two entirely different things. The Caldwell fortune did not collapse because of the crash of 1929. The crash was just the moment the existing damage became visible. The real collapse had been building for years inside decisions that each looked reasonable on their own, each proposal slightly more leveraged than the last, each success making the next risk easier to justify. That is how dynasties actually fall. Not in one catastrophic moment, in a sequence of individually defensible choices that nobody steps back far enough to see as a pattern. The skyline of New York still carries what the Caldwell family built and financed: the tunnels, the bridge approaches, the early towers, the infrastructure that has outlasted the fortune that made it possible by nearly a century. The family is gone. The city remains. And somewhere in drawer 17 of a storage archive in Lower Manhattan, 4 people stand before a half-finished skyline. 2 patriarchs, 2 daughters, captured at the exact moment before everything they built began its long, quiet, invisible unraveling. Certainty. Then expansion. Then silence. That is the full story of the Caldwell Consortium. And it is not as rare as it should be. Right now, somewhere in this country, a family is sitting around a table making a decision that feels exactly like opportunity. The numbers look good. The momentum is real. The city outside the window is moving fast, and everyone around the table believes they are moving with it. Some of them are right. Some of them are sitting in the middle of a story that will end up in a drawer that nobody visits. The question is, which one are you watching right now? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story made you think differently about how wealth is actually built and lost, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Every story on this channel exists to make you think harder, look deeper, and understand the real history that most people never get told. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story coming to this channel is one that will stop you completely. There was a dynasty that dwarfed the Caldwells in size. A collapse even quieter. A single decision forever altered the financial landscape of an entire American city. You do not want to miss it.